And so, in the next chapter of Spengler here is chapter 5, Cities and Peoples, letter B, Peoples, Races, and Tongues. And so, in this chapter, we begin to move into Spengler's theories of race and language. And I want to divide this into two separate discussions, since his theory of race um, is a separate theory from his theory of language. He puts the two in the same chapter, but it really ought to be broken into two separate chapters, in my opinion. Now, I know you're inwardly cringing here, hearing about a German living in Munich having racial theories in the 1920s, but I think what you'll find here is that Spengler's theories of race are substantially and fundamentally different from anything even remotely resembling Nazi racial theory. So different that you can see why he didn't like the Nazis and why he says in his last book, The Hour of Decision, that he thought they were idiots with superficial theories about race. His theories about race are very, very different. Now, at first glance, it is a kind of Blutenboden theory, and the Blutenboden theory is basically what everyone associates Nazi ideology with, that the folk, das Volk, are rooted in the land, and it's strong German nationalism and pride, and its assertion of German nationalism, and it's the strength and power of the land that the German people derives from the blood that's been in the land forever. But that very theory, actually, what the Nazis miss there is that the people that are in the land ought to include everyone in that land, which is what Spengler's going to say. You can't use a theory based on the land to differentiate separate ethnic groups that are living in that same land as a single people. Everyone living in one land constitutes one single racial group, as he goes on to say. So he starts off by saying that he identifies race with the Dasein side. Remember the Dasein-Voxein polarity that he started the book with. Dasein is the pulse, beat, rhythm. It's time, temporality, the cosmic structures of time and unfolding and destiny. Race belongs on that side. It's linked with the blood and the generations through procreation, the blind procreation over time. Then on the other side we have Voxein, and he links language with Voxein, with waking being, and he says that so race comes out of the cosmic aspect of a landscape, but the language is a means of intercommunication between individuals, connections of Voxein, of waking being, between individuals in a landscape. And then he's going to go on and say that there are two different types of language. There is expression language and there is communication language. Communication language is just what it sounds like. It's a language in which an I presupposes a thou, and in which everything that is said is addressed to another. That's one type of language. But there's another type of language in which the only thing presupposed is the I. There is no presupposition of an other, and this will have to do with a language that simply signifies a presence. This is what he will group artistic style forms of a particular civilization versus that of another, is a type of expression language that isn't addressed to anyone else. It's simply an expression of the I-ness, the there-ness of the civilization in question. So all the grand arts of form, painting and architecture and music and sculpture and so forth, come under this heading of a culture's expression language. So that's how he begins the discussion here. Then he moves on into saying that this sheds light on the old distinction, the old anthropological distinction, now outdated, of totem versus taboo. Freud wrote a book called Totem and Taboo, which was his refutation of Jung's Wandlungen and Symbole der Libido, transformations and symbols of the psyche, in which Freud's primary thesis was a Fraserian thesis, a very rationalistic one, and a historically literal one, that all of religion had emerged out of an initial murder, a primordial murder of a horde murdering their father or the patriarch who had all the women, and they murder it and they repress it, but they remember it in the creation of ritual. That's the taboo side, the creation of the ritual, where there's a symbolic eating of the father in the ritual, and that this is the origin. This original primordial event is the origin of all symbol and myth. So it's a historical, literal theory of myth, and it has its limitations insofar as it is literally historical. So that's the totem and taboo thing, and he says, Spengler then goes on to say that the racial side has to do with the totem side. We can think of the totem as the original god who is descended, who mated at some point with a mortal, and the bloodline is descended from this original totem, whether it's a totem animal or a totem god. It propagates itself through the generations, whereas the taboo side has to do with rules, proscriptions, what can and can't be done. And the arts of form are going to come under the totem side. Language comes under the totem side. It has to do with rules and conventions, stereotypes and cliches, the do's and the don'ts of both speaking as well as creating art. This is the taboo side. So what he's going to say then is that he says that insofar as this affects aesthetics, he says that of all expressions of race, the purest is the house. So, and by this he means that a house form, a people's house form, is rooted in a particular geographical landscape, and it's an entirely unconscious expression of living within that landscape, and that this goes under, it's separate from the arts of form, which belong under expression language and style history. It belongs on the totem side, the racial history side, which is more unconscious, and in which art forms such as house, clothing, pottery, furniture, weapons, this is all unconscious, and it's there in the early peasant's expression, naive expression forms of the house that he lives in a particular landscape, in the basic villages, but that it's very different and incredibly conservative. It's there, the style form of a peasant house is there before the culture picks up and begins to enter into its springtime phase with castle and cathedral in the West, in which we get an evolution, a metabolism of style forms that form over time, different architectural styles that move through Gothic and Baroque and Rococo and Modernist and so forth. Those style formations may glide over the surface. Some of that ornamentation language may glide over the surface of the peasant, the basic house form, the basic dwelling, but it won't alter it in any fundamental way. The ornamentation, the windows may at one point have sort of Gothic pointed arches, at another point they might be curved like Baroque style, but the basic house form stays the same, and once the culture has completed itself and finished metabolizing its style transformations, the peasant form will persist for millennia. And indeed to this day, this is true of peasant styles in places like Iraq, where in the southern marshes of Iraq we've got houses that are built using the reeds in the marshes of southern Iraq that create reed-based house forms that, to this day, if you look back at Sumerian cylinder seals from 3500 BC, you can see the same house on there. So there's been an incredible conservation of style form over thousands of years of building the same way. You can find in the Middle East, in villages there, if you glance at photographs of them, underneath the modern telegraph poles and wires, you see flat adobe roofed houses made out of mud brick, exactly the way the Sumerian peasants built them 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. They're still there. You can find domical roof-shaped houses in northwest Africa that are also built out of adobe that have been in that landscape and have been conservative and traditional for thousands of years. So I think Spengler's absolutely right about this, that the peasant and the villager has an incredible conservatism that survives the great higher dramas and agonies of the metabolisms of high civilization that simply glides the style forms across the native peasant, clothing, furniture, tools, pottery, weapons, may transform them in adding some ornamentation language to them, but basically the ornamentation language slides off, and what you're left with is the original native forms that are there, rooted to that landscape. Now what he will then say is that the whole point of this is his theory of race, which is that race is something that is rooted to a particular landscape. And it doesn't matter what ethnic populations go through that landscape. The blood doesn't matter, as it did for the Nazis. It's the landscape itself that affects not only the nature of the style forms in that landscape, but also the morphology, the actual physical morphology of the body itself tends to take on a conservation that stays the same within that landscape, and it affects everyone in that landscape the same way. So that he says, if emigrations of an Englishman or a German to America cease to be English and German once they get there and have children. The very next generation that is born in America are no longer and can no longer be regarded as English and German people, basically. Now they're American. the influence of the land, and it's mysterious. There is no causal explanation for it. Immediately sets to work on the gene pool in a mysterious way that we still don't understand, but it definitely does. It's there. And he says that if you look at, for example, anthropologists have looked through the remains of the Sea Peoples, and the Sea Peoples was a very heterogeneous group of all different kinds of races that invaded Egypt in the time of Ramses III. And if you look at the graves, basically we know that all these different races were involved, Dorians and Philistines and these ones and those ones. But if you look at the graves, the skeletons basically all look morphologically identical. And not only that, they tend to contain a morphological identity, a same basic skull shape, regardless of what race goes through that region, at least insofar. Incoming peoples might bear different racial characteristics, the so-called long-headed types versus the short-headed types. But once they get into that landscape, the average shape of the skeleton will tend to be the same, no matter what the different racial origin of the people in that landscape was originally. So it's the landscape that's the determining factor on a people, and a race then is rooted into a geographical landscape such that once a race leaves that landscape, it ceases to be that race. It's no longer the race, and the race becomes extinct. And therefore the effects of this on the Nazi, remember that the Nazi racial theory is precisely based on racial migrations of Indo-Aryans that have come from other lands, some mysterious Thule regions, icy Arctic regions in the north that have come down, and the bloodline has become mixed with non-Indo-Aryan peoples that have polluted it and degenerated it, and the idea is to purify the blood by getting rid of alien cultural elements, Jews and Slavs and so forth. There's none of that in Spengler, because anytime a race moves into a landscape, the immediate generation of the descendants of those people that came in cease to be that original race and become part of the race of the native landscape that they've moved into. So you can't use Spengler's theory of race to justify a theory about cultural otherness. The German Jews are Germans in Spengler's view. They belong in that landscape. They have the same morphological characteristics as everyone else, and there's no possible way of differentiating the blood, of finding a pure Indo-Aryan blood in that landscape. Since everyone belongs there, has the same basic morphological characteristics, and their culture forms will express themselves through the culture forms that are native to that particular landscape. So any theories that try to separate out these ones or those ones and justify the creation of concentration camps and genocide and ethnic cleansing isn't going to find a justification in Spengler's particular type of Blütenboden theory, which puts the emphasis decisively on the Boden, on the landscape, not the blood, whereas the Nazis put the emphasis on the blood. The blood for them is the decisive factor. In Spengler, the blood doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter anything. It's the cultural style forms of a particular geographical region, and the racial isolation of the gene pool in that region by geographical circumstance that creates and differentiates a racial identity. So this is not a theory that should, I think, make anyone nervous. It is a theory that does lend itself to cultural otherness, to recognizing, that the Chinese are a different people than the Hindus, completely different. They're different styles of thinking, different ethnicities, different values, different everything, different physiognomic features. Everything is different because they have been isolated in that geographical landscape for long periods of time. But within those, the various racial distinctions in China that you find there, the Han Chinese versus the Chinese others that don't belong there, that other groups will. None of that in Spengler. It's all the entire civilization is not. It's not a matter of this group expressing this style form and that group expressing that style form. It's all one big deal, one big cultural undertaking. And the influence of the land is indeed a kind of a mysterious thing. I remember Jung remarking on when he came to America, saying that he thought that the facial features of Americans bore very strong resemblances to the Native American facial features, in that we tend to have higher cheekbones like Native Americans, broader faces like Native Americans, and that's a mysterious process. That's a mysterious process that happens. The same way that he noticed that if you look at the skyline of our cities like New York, they look similar to the skyline, the rectilinear skyline of a pueblo. And it's not the case that the guy who invented the skyscraper saw the Pueblo and said, hey, let's build our buildings like the Pueblos were built. It doesn't work that way. It's spontaneous, and it comes up unconsciously as simply the nature of the land. And when a people moves into a landscape and it brings alien cultural traditions with them, at first there will be a conflict as the alien cultural traditions will try to continue to assert their identity for long periods of time. But gradually through the process of acculturation, the traditions of the natives who have been in that landscape for a much longer period will slowly begin to thrust their way up through the surface.